But we'll move on to Larry.
Early days of the farm.
Early days, right. Okay, so the Lampman family, I think you said, well, maybe it was in the intro, I don't know, came originally from the Netherlands, and it's one of the Rojan area's oldest ones. Tell us something about your oldest ancestors in the area.
Well, my ancestors from Holland came to Coxsackie in 1704. And as I understand it, a group came to Kopek in 1813. And they were on Midfield Farm, which is, I think it's the Midfield. You go down and take Route 3, it's the first farm on the left. So my great-grandfather was born there in 1846. My grandmother was born at Chrysler Pond in 1880 and moved to a farm that I grew up on, and then married a Lampman close by. Before we get too far with that, I wanted to say that I have a picture of Judy's horse that was just north of her, and it had like the color had a saddle on it. Like, remember that horse?
I remember. One horse, which one? Was it the Pinto or the?
Yeah, Pinto. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other is, my wife can testify, but I actually would do some tedding on our great big hill, and the very same thing kind of happened with her. And so that was the last time she'd ever get on that tractor. Anyway, she did help me after that some, but stay away from the hill.
Larry, your ancestors had an unusual possession. Could you talk about that?
One of my ancestors, and I don't know which one, had a slave. And I don't know the exact dates, but when slaves were freed after the Civil War, one of them went to Great Barrington and married a woman by the name of Burkhardt, a white woman, I think. And their grandson is W.E.B. Du Bois.
Who is one of the founders of the NAACP.
Yes, I didn't realize what a brilliant man he was. And he was a very learned person.
What did your ancestors, what kind of farming did they do when they first came?
Well, on the farm that I grew up on, my grandfather, I back up just a little bit, Livingston from Scotland, when he came here, he came from a town in Scotland called Ancrum, A-N-C-R-U-M, and when he came here, he named it Ancram. And because there were a lot of sheep raised in Scotland, he encouraged farmers here to raise sheep. So my grandfather, that I never knew because he died when my dad was 10, he raised sheep and driving horses. And when you go in some of these woodlands that used to be all pasture, you see the page wire fence, so you know sheep were there.
Thank you. By the way, I'm just going to mention quickly, we know Kopek as a dairy community, which now has pretty much changed completely. But when the first farming that was done was wheat by the colonists, and it's changed over the couple of centuries. We know an older era before TV and before computers, and you knew, you know about your farm. Can you talk about your farm in the early days, in the late 30s? What was it like there, living on the farm?
Well, I wasn't born till 43, so I didn't. But before I answer that, I want to talk a little bit about Kopek, because this was a mecca for dairy farmers. The Dean farm was right across from the bank. Mike Langen's farm was just back past the post office. Grant Langen's farm was up just another quarter mile, and Sookie Langdon, what was his name? He had the next farm over. I mean, they were everywhere here. Over at the Dean farm, there was Clarence Carl had that farm. Dick Dunning down the road a little. I mean, they're everywhere. Head's farm down below Ackley's. Edelman.
Snook Hill.
Yeah, and
Miller.
to add to that, the farm I grew up on in 1976, it's 4.5 miles long, and there were 9 dairy farmers. There's one left, and that's owned by a wealthy doctor, and he rents it to a very sharp dairyman. But guess how many farms are left in the town of Copic? Any guesses? None. Dramatic. There's some, I just heard the other day, one's being built in the Dakotas of 25,000 cows. And there is that kind of thing around the country.
Commercial farm.
Yeah, and it is back to money, even though real estate prices, there's pressure here from the 8 million people that live 100 miles down the road. But I wanted to talk about that, just the history of Copic that way. And I'll even go another step, and that is, in the early days, the milk got put in milk cans. There's one sitting outside, or it's right there on the stage, I think. And Copic was the first town in the country to have a bulk tank. Otherwise, and the first one, and it was celebrated in the early 70s.
Who was that, Greg?
Well, the farms, our farm was one of them. There were half a dozen farms that went with that bulk tank. And I think Ackley's and Langdon's
And define that if you would.
what's,
Define that when
oh,
you say
bulk tank,
tank.
well, rather than a milk can, you had a great big tank inside the barn. And a truck came and pumped it out and took it to the processor. Now, previous to that time, with the milk cans, we had the Borden milk plants. There's one here in Copic, one in Pine Plains, one in Ancrumdale, one in Hillsdale, and the farmers transported their milk cans early with horse and wagon, but later with a truck. So when the bulk tanks took over, that was the end of milk in cans. And so we have to then wash the tank, because with the milk cans, they would go to the city via a thing called the milk train. So all this milk here, from all these Borden plants, New York, for those probably 3 million people then.
Now, what I was going to try to get to, and I'll do it
Okay.
now. Your parents didn't have a refrigerator when they were growing up on farms.
No. Okay, I'm gonna get to the ice box in a moment, but before that, we raised pigs every year, 4 pigs. And my dad would cure the bacons and the hams in this 50-gallon crock, gorgeous thing. But the sausage went to a place called Lynx, which was just up the street here, and that also had a community freezer. So you'd rent a locker box and store stuff that you wanted to freeze. But also, we had our sausage made there. And growing up, we had sausage and pancakes 7 days a week. But it was delicious. We never got tired of the sausage. Meanwhile, my dad, we grew a lot of potatoes. He had cream potatoes 3 times a day. Honest, I mean, all the time. And farmers had to be frugal. I mean, you don't know what work is until you've lived on a dairy farm, I swear. I mean, it's just no vacation, 7 days a week, early in the morning, getting up 4:30, finishing at 6 at night, and the shortest day, Sunday, would still be 7 hours. So I experienced all that, like in the barn young, sitting on a cow and learning how to braid bale string.
Oh, yeah.
There were fun things like that. I had a pet chicken, I had bullheads in the stock tub. A lot of fun. Next question.
Okay, well, what was the relationship between ice on ponds
Oh, there you go.
and milk?
Yeah, okay. Well, to cool the milk and to have an ice box in your house, you had to go cut ice. And some of these milk factories had, like Hillsdale had the milk pond, they called it the milk pond, where they cut ice. Ancrumdale has a big one. I don't remember where Copic's was though. Where did
Copic
they?
Lake,
Oh,
I think.
Copic,
Copic Lake.
or Robinson Pond,
Robinson
maybe.
Pond.
Robinson
Lake.
Pond.
Well, our farm didn't have any ponds close by, so we went to Long Pond, which is connected to Upper and Lower Rhoda. And my dad tells a story, and I'm not sure how old he was, but I'm gonna guess he was somewhere between 10 and 15. And the way they do that is it's kind of a cutter that scores, goes out on the ice and scores. And before I mention that, we must have had a lot more cold weather in those days because there were big chunks of ice. And we just don't see that anymore, although I remember quite a while ago, Copic Lake having 2 feet of ice in a severe winter. So anyway, they'd score that, and then they would kind of break off the chunks, and the horses are with the wagon out on the ice. Something happened, they don't know what, but the reins somehow got caught in something, the horses backed up and drowned. And that was a traumatic experience, and that was your tractor of the day. Now luckily they raised horses, so maybe it wasn't hard to replace them, but that was a pretty miserable experience. And I heard from someone else that to prevent that happening, it wasn't the only time that happened to people, they would unhook the horses so if one backed up or did something funny, the other one wouldn't drown with it, which is good. So that was, I tell that story, I should write it down because that's, I think, a good one.
You mentioned that you had some problems on the farm with flooding. Could you talk about that?
With
Flooding.
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 Oh, yes. We rented the Rockefeller farm, no relation to the oil people, on Route 3. And when Route 3 was redone at some point, it was unusual because they put an underpass in for the cows to go, or heifers, to go from the barns out into the meadow. And meadow, because the juncture of that farm, at the corner of it is where Bashbish and Rojan come together. And so that's pretty notorious for flooding, especially because the dam in Ankrum, plus the lay of the land, automatically floods that whole thing called Drownland Swamp. And so our meadow is part of that. So there were many instances where I remember one time my dad finished planting the corn with a 2-row, originally a horse-drawn corn planter, do 70 acres with a 2-rower. It got dark, he left the tractor there and it rained, and it flooded the field. Another time we had cut the oats, so it was corn, oats, and hay were the rotations. And he harvested all the oats and we hadn't picked up the straw yet, and another big rain and the straw floated off of the field. That was pretty unusual. All along the fence line was all filled with straw. So, yeah, it still floods a lot. In fact, this year was really extreme. 3 times, January, February, March, something like that, the meadow flooded. And I'd never seen it that much. Usually it was one every year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, but routinely, I mean, you couldn't. And a little note on that, I remember swimming where the juncture of the Bashbish and the Rojan come together. And when you were at that junction, you could feel warm water in the Rojan and cold water in the Bashbish. That was really quite unique.
That's because it came off the mountain.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, as we've heard already, living on a farm has some risks. Things happen. And you talked about kind of an unusual situation that involved your sister.
Oh, yes, right, yeah. Well, I got some photos here, and one of them, you can't see them, but this is my dad on a wagon of loose hay. Before bales came along, we got a baler in '51, it was all loose hay. So there was a thing called a hay loader that you towed behind the wagon, and it would elevate the loose hay into the wagon and drop it on top of it. Well, after you fill that wagon with hay, you would tow it into the barn on what you call the threshing floor. It's the center of the upper floor of the barn. Well, there's this thing called a hay fork, which is a big U with a couple of latches on the bottom. So you would put it down into the load of hay sitting on the barn floor, and it was connected by a rope going up to a track and a runner, and the rope went all the way outside, and that was either towed by a tractor or a horse. To pull that, lift that mass of hay, it would pick up 6 feet wide, I don't know, it would probably do about 1/8 of the load at a time. Well, something happened where, yeah, there's right there. This is from the outside, and we had an outside one too. This is a great photo. On a wagon with no rubber wheels, by the way, it was iron wheels. So something happened, there's a thing called a trip rope. Once you get it back in the back of the mow where you want it, you pull the rope, and it makes the whole load fall in the mound, and then you have people there with a fork putting it out, distributing it in the edges of the mound. Well, something happened. My little sister, who was about 4, the rope tripped, and she was in the first bay with no hay in it, and it dropped on top of her. And it's like, whoa. I remember being there. It was sort of traumatic. And it was a hired man and maybe my dad and uncle. And they started with a hay fork to get the hay off. And I remember them saying, don't use a fork, don't use a fork. So we pulled all the hay off, and my sister was unaffected. She didn't hurt her a bit. In fact, I asked her about that recently. She doesn't even remember it. Of course, she was pretty little. She was pretty little. But that was one of the few, I guess you'd call it an accident, but nobody got hurt, so.
Thank you, Larry. I mentioned that Judy wanted